Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, 7 after 8 o'clock exactly. Our first guest for the morning is lined up ready to speak with us. And he, of course, is Malik Dasoo, social and environmental justice activist. Assalamu alaikum to you. Welcome to the program.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you for having me, Julie.
I have to ask you this. How have you found yourself? How have you come into this space regarding, the whole issue around activism? I know your father, Dr. Dasoo, also speaks out against social injustices. We've talked with him several times on the show regarding all of the shenanigans at state hospitals, etc. And here you are this morning talking with us, being a social and environmental justice activist.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think I found myself in this space, and I was fortunate enough to be brought up with, left-leaning parents, parents who are engaged in social justice issues from, early parts of their life, and instill that culture in me to look for injustices in the world and do whatever I can to mute them. I got into the climate justice space. Largely through my studies. I did my master's in international land and water management, where I saw the impacts that climate change is having on people's ability to grow food, ability to gain access to water, and when you sort of come to terms with the fact that billions of people stand to be displaced or die as a result of the climate crisis, you can't look away anymore.
And sadly, it is us human beings that are directly responsible for the situations that we find ourselves in, be it environmental or be it the suppression of peoples. You might have heard me talking about the Rohingya people as well. So we are directly responsible. And as much as we bang on about these issues, it just seems that all of these issues seem to gain traction and get much, much worse. I sometimes wonder if all the activism and all of the noises that we make is falling on deaf ears.
Well, that's the exact reason why we set up this organization, Extinction Rebellion. It started from the acknowledgement that what groups are doing, we can talk about a whole range of issues, but particularly on climate change, it came from the acknowledgement that what the climate change NGOs and activist groups are doing is not working, right? The sort of the passive approach to activism, the organizing of large marches, of pickets, of memorandum handovers, of petitions, they just don't work because you're dealing with deeply vested interests and deep power structures. So the Extinction Rebellion arose from, a study of how social movements happen and change regimes. So they looked at the civil rights movement in the US. They looked at the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. They looked at the Serbian liberation struggle. And all of them have the same common thread to them, right? They have a small group of sustained and active civil society engaging in mass civil disobedience, people breaking the law to get this message across. That's what changes the needle, and there's very clear reasons why that happens, right? The one reason is that you sort of make the implicit violence of the state and of different institutions explicit. So they come out and they violently assault you. People gain sympathy for your cause and they join in, or at least they take their next step in the activist struggle. The other reason is that these institutions and these governments, they lose their legitimacy. And if it grows large enough, that translates into financial risks, into legal risks, and then they're really put on the back foot. So there's a clear formula for how to make this work, and that's what we're trying to do in South Africa.
Well, we wish you strength and longevity, because obviously we need voices to be heard. Muzzled voices, or voices that have been muzzled for a very long time. They need to be heard and action needs to be taken. You talk about vested interests, and we know that it runs really very, very deep. Oftentimes on this very show, when I talk about corrupt government officials, politicians, etc., I sometimes get pushback suggesting that it's the corporate world and the Western world that has created this type of corruption the world over, very especially in our country. They also talk about it is so easy to get people to collude with you, people that have been hungry for a very long time, people who have been dispossessed for a very long time. Very, very easy to get them to collude with your agenda. Do you think that this is all part of that new world order, that large corporates, the global corporate world is pushing that agenda and getting into underdeveloped countries like Africa with this issue with Standard Bank and the crude oil pipeline project? This is just an example of the many other that we've seen playing out over the years. And I kind of wonder what next. And this is all being driven by power, control, greed, subjugation, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah, well, I fully agree. I think it is definitely being driven by that. And I think the one point you mentioned is that these corporates who are involved in it, they don't try to hide that fact. This is something that they sort of acknowledge, but they craft creative stories around it to try and distract from the issues. So, for example, Standard Bank with this crude oil pipeline, they'll say it bolsters economic growth, but economic growth is just how you define it, right? So, yeah, it bolsters economic growth for a wealthy elite, for their rich and corporate clients. It bolsters wealth for governments who are often corrupt and, as you say, hungry for this sort of money. So they'll accept it. But those benefits don't translate to the ground, to the communities where it's actually needed. The second thing is they say is, well, we're creating jobs. What they neglect is that those jobs are transient. Right? They exist for a few months in the year, and then they're gone for the communities on the ground, for the low skilled labor. Those projects, they attract high skilled individuals, maybe from those countries or abroad, and those are the jobs that last. Those are the jobs that they're talking about but don't want to admit to. The third thing is they'll say, well, we're providing energy access for Africa, which is not true, right? Those projects, like the East African crude oil pipeline, is designed to take oil from Uganda to the port of Tanzania for export to Europe, to North America, and the rest. So, the Western countries, Western corporates, they're all centrally involved in sustaining this economic system of extracting value from Africa, leaving us with very little benefits to show for it, and just lining their pockets even more.
Okay, I understand that four of South Africa's banks, ABSA, Investec, Nedbank, and FirstRand, have said they won't finance the pipeline, and yet Standard Bank has opted to come on board. Thus, we're having this interview, and also we do know that there's been silent protests outside of the head office, etc. Why do you think that their thinking is not in line with the rest of the other four people that I've mentioned, the other four banks?
I can only speculate. I have no idea. It's an answer that we've been trying to get from them for the past 3 years, and we still can't get a clear response from them. My only sort of answer to that is that the revenues that they would generate from this project are enormous. And I think that's probably the only prospect they can hang on to, at least for their shareholders. And so that would be my one response. I think also now they've been put under such pressure from groups like ourselves that they can't back down now, because they'll be seen to sort of be cowering to civil society's demands, which is not a good look for a bank that's trying to show that shareholders that we take your financial interests as our first priority. So I think there's also that element at play. But as you mentioned, the other banks have acknowledged the risks, the social risks, displacing 100,000 people and families, destroying livelihoods. destroying precious wildlife corridors that are sort of the last strongholds of biodiversity on this continent, and adding billions and millions of tons of CO2 emissions into our atmosphere when the scientists are telling us we can't have any more. So they've acknowledged those risks. We're trying to get Standard Bank to, but it seems like, yeah, well, I would say that it seems like the pressure is mounting on them.
Okay, and yet they seem to be standing quite firm. And they, despite being heavily criticized by activists like yourselves for its involvement in the controversial East Africa crude oil pipeline project, they still dead set on financing the oil and gas projects in the short and medium term to support economic development across the African continent, is what they're saying. Perhaps if we try and kind of look deeper, is there some truth in supporting the African continent, trying to, they have also made a statement saying that Africa is the least developed continent in the world, and by supporting this project, they are going to help speed up the development of Africa. Your thoughts? Development at what cost?
Exactly, exactly. So, I mean, well, let's first look at how this is played out in other parts of the continent, right? If we look at northern Mozambique in Cabo Delgado, Standard Bank's financing of gas production there has led to militant groups killing thousands of people, women being raped in rural villages, and all for economic gains, but economic gains for who? Those economic gains don't translate into sustained benefits for the community, right? There's no guarantee that once these projects get off the ground, that the money generated will result in social development. That money often gets captured into the hands of a very small, wealthy corporate elite, and oftentimes government, and those governments can't guarantee social spending. Right, in Africa, we have such terrible ratios of government spending on social upliftment to the revenues that they create, and so communities have nothing to show for it. So that's why I say, economic development, economic growth is just how you define it. In the East African crude oil pipeline, firstly, let me say, Standard Bank puts 120 billion rand a year into their fossil fuel investments. South Africa's just energy transition costs alone for solar, for wind, for hydro would come to about 475 billion. What that means is that Standard Bank, just through its fossil fuel investments, can finance almost a quarter of South Africa's energy needs for the entire country. Imagine you take the top 4 banks in the country and you add their fossil fuel finance together. So it's also a choice about how you direct that finance, right? There's nothing that necessitates their spending on fossil fuels. That economic growth is just it's a way of how you define it, and it can be spent on renewable energy to bolster that economic growth.
Okay, where are we now regarding this issue? This has been a couple of years. It's been in the pipeline for a couple of years. Your organization, as has other organizations, made their opinions quite known to Standard Bank and the likes of a Standard Bank. Where do we stand with this right now?
Yeah. So what they'll say is that they're waiting on an environmental and social assessment that they've contracted for the project to understand the impacts on the environment and on the people there. Oftentimes these are sort of box ticking exercises. The compensation paid to the families who've been displaced is minimal. And the environmental protection measures that they take are sort of the most cost-effective ones. And so, we're waiting on the assessment of that report, and that's what Standard Bank says is going to be their ultimate deciding factor. We don't know when we'll expect to hear that. We got a suggestion yesterday that Standard Bank want to finance this project, but nothing to confirm it. So yeah, in terms of where we stand, we're pretty much at the same point that we were 3 years ago,
Sure.
albeit with a lot more pressure on Standard Bank than was initially the case. And I just want to stress that I think yesterday's action of us occupying the annual general meeting instead of our traditional way of sort of going with a normal picket and handing over a memorandum which gets read and thrown in the dustbin, and we never hear about it for years after that. We're not doing that anymore. Now we're taking it into their offices and holding them to account. And the media is catching on to it, which is exactly what Standard Bank needs to be pressed.
Malik, let's take a look at a short clip about yesterday's eviction. And then I'd like you to give me further comment on that and where to from here now for you as an organization. And what's the message? What do you want to see playing out? Let's just take a look at that clip first. Okay, I don't think my controller heard me.
What do we want? Justice. When do we want it? What do we want? When do we want it?
Okay, there should have been more people there, shouldn't there? More activists. I would have liked to have seen a way bigger crowd, but I guess you guys would have been barred from entering the premises.
Yeah, and that's the point, right? So what we did was we convened around 6 a.m. Because we knew there was a mass protest happening outside, and we knew that security recognized me by now. That as soon as they see me, they set up their barricades and security personnel so that they don't let me in. But we set up at 6 a.m. We went in with a group of about 15 people before security had set up. We were waiting in the wings, sort of waiting for shareholders to start filtering into the AGM. We forged letters to say that we were there to attend the AGM. So a lot of different measures to make sure that we got into the building. We got into the building, and once we were there, we sort of waited for a while, and we set up the occupation. So what that clip doesn't show is that there were about 15 people behind us who are sort of holding the line in front of the door, including a really good friend of mine, Juleka Latib, who's a famous social justice activist from Kopanang. The person who is being carried away with me there is Kumi Naidu, famous anti-apartheid and social rights activist. So there were some people, and as soon as we were carried out, we were greeted with a crowd of about 450 people outside.
Wow.
But you're right, that's what's needed, right? Imagine those 450 had occupied that building. That AGM wouldn't
Sadly,
have.
that won't be a possibility because they'd get the police and all sorts of security in to suppress you guys. Where to from here? What's the next step going forward? It
Right.
seems clear that Standard Bank's going to go ahead. It's a huge investment as far as they're concerned, and they're only interested in bottom line. Where to from here with you, Malik Dasoo, and the rest of your organization, other such organizations as well?
Yeah. Well, where to from here? I mean, yesterday's action could have been held at 100 different institutions or government departments in this country, all of whom are failing to support people and put people and planet before profit. So there's that element, right? Is that we can choose any institution in this country. So even if ECOP goes ahead, it doesn't matter for our cause. We will continue. And the call here for us is for the NGOs to wake up. They need to realize that what they're doing is not working. They need to realize that taking a more radical stance on these issues is exactly what's needed to move the needle. So where to from here for us? We think we've made the case for why civil disobedience is important. We'll continue to make that case for the rest of the year with a pipeline of projects aimed at different financial institutions, government departments, a whole host of organizations, the community-based organizations that we work with. They've identified a number of targets that they want to hit. And we'll continue breaking the law, doing what's necessary until our issues are heard, and until we start to see success. But it's a call for all the social justice, all the environmental justice activists to join us in the civil disobedience approach.
Undoubtedly, lots of your energy and time is being spent on this particular issue, the Standard Bank issue. What other issues are you guys looking at?
Yeah, sure. So I should mention that I do this just as a volunteer. I have a day job as a researcher. But, so it does take a lot of energy. But so this action happened as a result of listening to Kumi Naidoo at his book launch talking about follow the money. So, the thinking is that if you cut off the money for a lot of these projects, they don't happen. So we target financial institutions. Those are sort of the primary ones on our radar. But we're also hosting a workshop soon with the organizers of the Treatment Action Campaign, who are going to helpfully inform us about how to organize this sort of pipeline approach to actions for the year. Because we can't just have a little flare up here, 6 months later, nothing happens, and then 2 months down the line, we have another action. It can't be like that. We need to have a sustained and active approach. And that's what we'll be figuring out. So all those targets, all the types of actions we'll be communicating soon. And I hope you guys will be able to join us in that journey.
Inshallah. Malik Dasoo, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Strength to you and your organization and to your volunteerism. We need your voices. We need them loudly and we need them to be heard. So continue doing what you're doing. Eventually, it's going to make a difference. So shukran so very much for that. Lovely talking with you. Go well. Assalamu alaikum.
And thank you so much for having me.
That was Malik Dasoo, social and environmental justice activist, talking to us about the climate activists that protested or are still in the process of protesting Standard Bank's controversial East Africa crude oil pipeline project forcefully. They were evicted at the Standard Bank AGM. We saw a clip of that, and all I say is strength to guys like them to make the voices heard of obviously people that are at risk with all of these projects going down all around the world. And oftentimes it is truly the most marginalized of societies that suffer the impacts of these greedy corporate people who just enrich themselves. And it's really a situation of the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. So that gap is closing, and these are the activists that are making the voices heard of the poorest of the poor. It is exactly 8:30 a.m. News and Views right here on Salam Media. Standing by to talk with us is Fatima Zahra Mayet. She's in the UK, and we are going to be talking about the Rohingya and the 10th annual Black for Rohingya movement.